LGB. 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 LGB.
They say LGB everywhere I go. LGB. What it means, I don't know. LGB. Whatever it is. LGB. Kamala, help me, please. Please.
Alrighty then.
I like you. LGB.
That's let's go, Brandon, right?
LGB.
This means let's go, Brandon.
No. LGB.
Sounds like let's go, Brandon, I guess.
LGB. All right. Let's go, Brandon.
I am Cornholio.
Chant LGB. Right wing and left wing. LGB. Go, you know the thing. LGB. If you don't sing that back. LGB. And you ain't black. LGB.
Let's go, Brandon.
LGB.
Let's go, Brandon.
LGB. Let's go, Brandon.
FJB. Let's go, Brandon.
I'm Joe Biden, and I
Forgot
this message.
Greetings, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Epic Threads. I'm your host, Patrick Gunnels, joining you from Houston, Texas, this February 5th, 2024 at 1:29 p.m. Central Standard Time. One piece for you today, the brilliant Erik Carlson on the Tavistock Institute. Before we get started, don't forget to go to epicthreads.tv, the home of Angel Paste, to pre-order your sweet orange infused Angel Paste, a burst of vitamin C for your skin, plus all the wonderful, luxurious oils that you find in Angel Paste. Epicthreads.tv, promo code Shapiro to pry $1 from my grasping hands. Your skin will drink it up. From badlands.substack.com, the Tavistock Institute, creating a mind control culture weapon by Erik Carlson. Have you ever wondered why certain things suddenly become hot topics seemingly out of nowhere? How one day you woke up and everyone was arguing about transgenderism, or people were supergluing themselves to the road to protest climate change, or how one day flash mob department store robberies started occurring and no one would even attempt to stop them. You could even look at changes that have occurred more slowly over time in America, like the abandonment of God in society or the destruction of a family. One could look at these things and assume times are changing and that it has all occurred organically. The truth is that none of it is organic, and that all of it has been carefully and meticulously planned out in a think tank by the elites. Culture is manipulated, used as a weapon to control populations. Some reading this won't believe some of the things I'm going to present, not because there isn't enough evidence to at least consider it, or because it doesn't line up with everything else one already understands about the cabal who runs the world. Some will likely reject some of the claims I present because they don't want to believe them. They want to protect the culture they know, kind of like how Lionel and Joyce Dahmer didn't want to believe their son ate people. Last summer, one couldn't avoid hearing about Taylor Swift and her sold-out concerts, how she was single-handedly keeping the economy afloat with her mega tour. I said to my wife during the summer, have you noticed how Taylor Swift is being pushed so hard on us this summer? She said, she's really popular. To which I responded that she's been around for 17 years and all of a sudden she's everywhere. I was able to avoid her for 17 years, but now it is impossible. She's in my face everywhere I turn. I said something is up with her. There is a reason she is currently being pushed so hard. In early September, I sat down with my wife to watch the first game of the NFL season. I fully expected to see a massive number of commercials with Super Bowl winning quarterback Patrick Mahomes. But what I didn't expect to see was even more commercials starring his tight end, Travis Kelce. He was literally on every other commercial they showed during the game. I said to my wife, something is up with Kelce. There's a reason why they are pushing him so hard. The next week, Kelce starred in a Pfizer vaccine ad. I knew something was up with him. The same week, Amazon Prime released a documentary called Kelce about Travis and his brother, who also plays in the NFL. Then it was announced that Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift were dating. She was showing up to all his games, and the camera panned to her in her suite whenever Kelce did anything. 2-yard reception, shot of Swift. At this point, it all came together for me. They were being hyped up to eventually throw their support to dementia patient Joe Biden. Later, I discovered that George Soros bought Swift's music catalog, and she would likely do anything to get it back. More recently, I discovered that our government is going to fund a movie that Travis Kelce wants to make. When and where did all this culture manipulation start? In the late 1800s and early 1900s, psychology as a medical field really took off. While the original intent of it may or may not have been to heal people's minds, it quickly became apparent that psychological techniques could also be used to manipulate and control people. Sigmund Freud was an early pioneer in psychoanalysis. His nephew, Edward Bernays, used psychological techniques he learned from his uncle to create the field of PR, as well as modern advertising. Would you be shocked if I told you that Bernays has a great nephew named Mark Randolph, who went on to be a co-founder and the first CEO of a company called Netflix? Yes, that Netflix. The one that eventually went on to produce woke material with the Obamas as board members. All a coincidence, of course. Freud's descendant, teaming with the Obamas to create woke material, including the normalization of pedophilia. With the dawning of the field of psychology and more efforts and resources going into understanding the human mind, World War I occurred. As many know, a big part of the war was fought in trenches, bombs exploding while soldiers took shelter and safety. As a result of this war, many soldiers suffered from shell shock, or what we today call PTSD. Symptoms of shell shock include tremors, loss of sight or hearing, and extreme fatigue. The trauma incapacitated many soldiers. I should take a step back and explain that most countries wanted to stay out of the Great War, including the U.S. Great Britain needed help. How could they convince other nations like the U.S. to join with them to defeat Germany? In stepped the Wellington House in 1914, also known as Britain's War Propaganda Bureau. Future Prime Minister David Lloyd George appointed the writer and fellow Liberal Member of Parliament Charles Masterman to head the organization. The operation was located in the Wellington House in London. Masterman invited 25 leading British authors to discuss the best ways of promoting Britain's interests during the war. Their biggest focus was to lure in America. Famous British authors who attended included Arthur Conan Doyle, G.K. Chesterton, Thomas Hardy, H.G. Wells, and, invited but unable to attend, Rudyard Kipling. Sorry if this destroys anyone's illusions about their favorite British authors, but some were commissioned to create propaganda. War of the Worlds, for example, was written in 1898. Orson Welles famously read an adaptation of the book on the radio in 1938. Why? In my opinion, to see how effectively propaganda could be used to create trauma. England and France declared war on Germany the following year. Propaganda was created by some of the greatest literary minds in England and distributed throughout the world. Again, their main focus was convincing Americans that they should ally with Great Britain to defeat Germany. Propaganda is mind control. The Bureau operated under the supervision of the Foreign Office. MI6. From Wikipedia, quote, the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, commonly known as MI6, Military Intelligence, Section 6, is the Foreign Intelligence Service of the United Kingdom, tasked mainly with the covert overseas collection and analysis of human intelligence on foreign nationals in support of its Five Eyes partners. SIS is one of the British intelligence agencies and the chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, C, is directly accountable to the Foreign Secretary. Formed in 1909 as the Foreign Section of the Secret Service Bureau, the section grew greatly during the First World War. End quote. Arthur Balfour became Foreign Secretary in 1916. His name is probably familiar to many reading this. He penned the Balfour Declaration, which was a promise to Lord Rothschild that England would create the State of Israel. Most are probably unaware that Balfour was in charge of the world's greatest spy service at the time. Documents have recently been released showing that Obama worked with England and the Five Eyes nations to spy on Trump going back to 2016, when he was still just a presidential candidate. I would argue that America has been overseen by British intelligence agencies since the forming of MI6, Britain's War Propaganda Bureau, and eventually the Tavistock Institute. The Tavistock Clinic. As the story goes, the Tavistock Clinic was formed in 1920 in London to research and treat victims of shell shock that occurred during the First World War. The clinic was headed by a psychiatrist named Hugh Crichton Miller. Crichton Miller was heavily influenced by the founder of analytical psychology, Carl Gustav Jung. Crichton Miller had made a name for himself for developing psychological treatments for shell-shocked soldiers during and after the First World War, yet the first patient treated at the clinic was, in fact, a child. Trauma-based mental disorders, trauma-based mind control. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Through the research and treatment of trauma-based mental disorders, psychiatrists discovered that trauma could be used to control people's minds. Trauma could be used on micro and macro levels. On a micro level, people could be brought into a clinical setting and exposed to trauma, drugs, LSD, and other psychological techniques, creating a mind-controlled person. The Tavistock program led to the CIA's MK Ultra program in the United States starting in 1953. Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, a British author, is said to be the person who introduced America to LSD. On a macro level, it was discovered trauma could be used effectively on the masses as well, constantly pushing fear on the general public through the media with periodic traumatic events leading to a population that is mind-controlled through fear. The JFK assassination, 9/11, COVID, all events that opened portals into the human mind to allow more mind control through fear narratives that followed each event. Narratives like climate change and transgenderism got their starts and continued push through Tavistock think tanks. None of the woke craziness experienced in America is organic, and none of it actually originated in America. Don't believe me? How's this for proof? From an independent article published on August 11th, 2022. Quote, Tavistock Gender Clinic facing legal action over failure of care claims. Clinic accused of rushing children, quote, into taking life-altering puberty blockers without adequate consideration or proper diagnosis. The Tavistock Gender Identity Clinic is facing legal action over claims children were misdiagnosed and rushed into transitioning at a young age. The clinic, which is being shut down by NHS England, was criticized by an independent review for the quality of care and services provided to patients who were predominantly young teenagers, expressing an interest in gender transitioning. Staff, patients, and parents have raised concerns that young people using the service were put on the pathway to transitioning too early and before they had been properly assessed. It is alleged children were, quote, rushed into taking life-altering puberty blockers without adequate consideration or proper diagnosis, with staff under pressure to adopt an unquestioning, affirmative approach. Mass legal action is now being pursued by lawyers against the clinic named the Gender and Identity Development Service, GIDS, which has treated 19,000 children with gender dysphoria since 1989. End quote. An important fact left out here is that the vast majority, almost all of these 19,000 transitions, occurred between 2012 and the close of the Gender Identity Clinic in 2022. Essentially, between 1989 to 2012, research was being done. Then in 2012, the rubber hit the road and the big push for transitioning occurred. Interesting that at the end of 2012, Obama repealed the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, allowing propaganda against Americans to become legal again. Immediately following this, transgender bathrooms became a hot topic in the U.S. Coincidence? I believe it was at this time that the transgender narrative was dropped on the U.S., created to divide and confuse America. Many other institutes spawned from and are connected to Tavistock. The Frankfurt School started in 1923, and the Stanford Research Institute was established in 1946, the year after World War II ended. It is said that the concept of a color revolution started at the Frankfurt School. The backbone of a color revolution is to overthrow a government through the use of propaganda. It is also said that the concept of political correctness was created at the Frankfurt School, created to divide a nation. Dividing it makes it weak. Political correctness was dropped on U.S. universities in the early 1990s and led to the wokeism we know today. The Stanford Research Institute has taken on the bulk of culture manipulation in America today, including the manipulation of the American school system. Let me give you an example of how culture manipulation has worked in America over the past 30 years. 30 years ago, political correctness invaded the U.S. Most of Gen X was in their 20s when it came. The next generation, the millennials, were very young to teens. The following generation, Generation Z, was not even born yet. Just for reference, ages 0 to 7 are extremely influential ages for Americans, while ages 8 to 25 are progressively less so. By age 25, the human brain is fully developed and more difficult to manipulate. Now, let's look at these three generations and how they identify sexually. According to a 2022 Gallup poll, 3.3% of Gen X identify as LGBT, 11.2% for millennials, and a whopping 19.7% for Gen Z. How is it possible for biology and genetics to change this fast and this drastically? The answer is it's impossible. Not to mention, people who identify as LGBT tend to have fewer children, which means the LGBT gene would be less likely to be passed on. The only explanation is that identifying as LGBT is up 600% in 3 generations because of influence put on people. An important thing to factor in is that this is how each generation identifies today, not 15 or 30 years ago, but today. Another thing to understand is that Tavistock and its founders are big proponents of eugenics, population control. Most of Gen X were in their 20s when political correctness started, and 3.3% identify as being LGBT. Millennials were very young to teens, and it's 11.2%. All of Gen Z were born into political correctness and even wokeness in some cases, and it's 19.7%. In short, the age in which one is influenced greatly determines how influenced they will become. I could do the same for climate change and the fear of it. The age one is when exposed to the climate change propaganda greatly determines how much one fears it. There are always exceptions. Some younger people are less influenced and some older people are more influenced, but generally speaking, the statistics show the age that you're at when you are first influenced plays a big role in molding your beliefs and your perceptions. The Tavistock Institute. From Wikipedia. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is a British not-for-profit organization that applies social science to contemporary issues and problems. It was initiated in 1946 when it developed from the Tavistock Clinic and was formally established as a separate entity in September 1947. The journal Human Relations is published on behalf of the Tavistock Institute by Sage Publications. The institute is located in G Street in Clerkenwell, London. The Tavistock Institute engages in educational research, consultancy, project evaluation, and professional development work founded on methodologies drawn from social sciences and applied psychology. The Institute's website describes its work as having a focus on how humans relate to each other and non-human systems, how people grow in character and are affected by learning, creativity, and change. End quote. The transition from a clinic to treat soldiers with shell shock to an influential think tank couldn't have happened without major financial donations from the Rockefeller family. Yes, that cabal family. Prior to the Tavistock Institute, the Tavistock Clinic was funded by the Rothschild and British royal families. Yes, those cabal families. Key figures that transitioned from the clinic to the Institute include British military psychiatrist John Rawlings Rees. A famous quote from Rees: "Public life, politics, and industry should, all of them, be within our sphere of influence. If we are to infiltrate the professional and social activities of other people, I think we must imitate the totalitarians and organize some kind of fifth column activity. If better ideas on mental health are to progress and spread, we, as the salesmen, must lose our identity. Let us all, therefore, very secretly be fifth columnists." End quote. Another key figure that transitioned into the think tank was German-American psychologist Kurt Lewin. Lewin is often recognized as the founder of social psychology and was one of the first to study group dynamics and organizational development. Lewin developed a model in the 1940s which is regarded as a cornerstone for understanding organizational change. He saw this as a three-stage process which he likened to melting a block of ice and refreezing it in a different shape. Social engineering, changing a population's belief system through societal pressure, peer pressure, forcing individuals to abandon their beliefs to fit in with society's perceived beliefs, melting the ice and reshaping it into the mold they choose. In other words, mind control. With children, the ice doesn't even have to be melted and then reshaped. Creating culture. Former MI6 intelligence agent John Coleman has spilled the beans on Tavistock and how it has manipulated culture and perceptions. Coleman claims pretty much every aspect of the American culture over the past century has been directly manipulated by Tavistock and its subsidiaries. According to Coleman, the CIA was founded and is run on the guidelines set up by the Tavistock Institute. All Tavistock and American Foundation techniques have one goal: to break down the psychological strength of the individual and render him helpless to oppose the dictators of the world order. The breakdown of the family, religion, patriotism, and the promotion of sexually deviant behavior are all tools used as weapons of control. Freudian psychotherapy techniques are used to create permanent mental illness in some. Henry Kissinger was a student of John Rawlings Rees, one of the influential founding members of Tavistock. Through Tavistock, the Stanford Research Institute controls America's National Education Association. The goal of the American education system is to create easily controlled people, trained not to be independent thinkers. John Coleman believes the 1960s American counterculture revolution was created by Tavistock and funded and put into action by the CIA. The use of LSD as a part of mind control started in the Tavistock Clinic, was used in the 1950s in the CIA's MK Ultra mind control program, then let loose on young Americans in the 1960s. Coleman claims the Tavistock Institute operates on an annual budget in the billions, and that it and all its subsidiaries are fully funded by U.S. taxpayers. Now for the controversial part. Coleman claims the bands the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Grateful Dead are all creations of Tavistock. He claims Theodore Adorno, a musicologist and social theorist and leading member of Tavistock/Frankfurt School, wrote all the Beatles' music and lyrics. But why? To create the 1960s American counterculture. If one thinks about it, the 1960s and 1950s were so different from each other. How could it have happened so fast and so drastically if it wasn't part of an organized plan to create a change? The decade of the 1960s created massive division in America, division between races, sexes, ages, moral values, and political views. Similar claims have been made by Dave McGowan in his excellent book, Weird Science Scenes Inside Canyon, where he makes it as clear as day that the CIA and military intelligence were connected to many of the rock bands that came out of the Laurel Canyon, California area in the 1960s. In 1962, the Beatles signed with EMI Records, which is claimed to be run by Tavistock. In 1967, the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, killed himself. In 1968, their lawyer, David Jacobs, killed himself. In 1969, Theodore Adorno, the Tavistock Frankfurt musicologist who is claimed to have written all the Beatles songs, died. In the same year of Adorno's death, the Beatles' music rights, Northern Songs, were sold from under Paul McCartney and John Lennon's noses to a company called ATV, Associated Television. In the spring of 1970, McCartney announced the Beatles had broken up. In 1985, Michael Jackson bought the Beatles catalog from ATV. To add insult to injury, it is also claimed that Tavistock paid local high school girls to show up at the airport and scream when the Beatles first came to America. I always thought girls' reactions to the Beatles in the early to mid-1960s kind of seemed a bit like mind control, if the story is true. It makes sense that paying girls to scream conditions other girls how to act. I honestly don't care if people believe bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were created by Tavistock to change culture. It's pretty clear to me that concepts like gender dysphoria, LGBTQ plus worship, wokeism, and climate change hysteria were planned out in think tanks, used to create division, as well as mental disorders in some. The evidence shows we've been manipulated and are still being manipulated into changing what we believe and how we think and react. It is to be hoped that everyone reading this is thinking, obviously, If our culture hasn't been manipulated to create a state of mind control, how do you explain so many young people wanting to change their sex in the past 10 years, or parents voluntarily subjecting their children to drag queen strip shows, or the panic over weather? How does one explain a population of people who stand by and do nothing, while their government does the opposite of what they ask them to do? And the most strange of them all, how does one explain teenage girls in the 1960s screaming for Ringo Starr? And that is the absolutely brilliant Erik Carlson. Erik, thank you for continuing your wonderful writing. Don't forget this his blog, erikc.substack.com. That article was featured at badlands.substack.com. Subscribe to both for a paid subscription if you have the means. Don't forget to go to epicthreads.tv. That's epicthreads.tv, the home of Angel Paste. The new Sweet Orange offering is available for pre-order to ship on March 8th. We will probably sell out before March 8th, so go ahead and get yours now. Use promo code Shapiro to pry $1 from my grasping hands. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thanks to Erik Carlson. Let us pray. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. I love you all. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you tomorrow.
I will be the greatest president that God ever created.